It was a typical Friday evening, and the small, family-owned restaurant was packed. But in the corner booth, tension was brewing like a storm. Racist customer insults black waitress, but instantly regrets it when her boss walks in. "Excuse me," a sharp voice cut through the noise. A middle-aged man with a red face and a sneer slapped his hand on the table. His name was Mr. Grayson, a regular customer who always seemed to find something to complain about. But tonight, his anger was directed at the young waitress, Jane, who stood before him, her notepad in hand and a forced smile on her face. "Yes, sir?" Jane asked, her voice calm despite the way her heart raced. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but something about the way Mr. Grayson was glaring at her made her stomach twist. "This coffee is cold," he snapped, shoving the cup toward her. "And this menu is filthy. Do you even clean in this place? Or are you all just too lazy to do your jobs?" Jane's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. "I'm sorry about the coffee, sir. Let me do a fresh cup, and I'll make sure the menu is cleaned." She reached for the menu, but Mr. Grayson snatched it away. "Don't touch it," he hissed. "I don't want your hands all over it. You people are always so careless. Why don't you go back to where you came from and let someone competent do your job?" The words hit Jane like a slap. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. Around her, the noise of the diner seemed to fade, replaced by a ringing in her ears. She could feel the eyes of other customers on her, some curious, some sympathetic, but none stepping in to help. "Sir," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I'm just trying to do my job. If there's a problem, I'd be happy to fix it. The problem is you." Mr. Grayson spat. "You and your kind, always thinking you deserve to be treated like everyone else. Well, newsflash, you don't. Now get me someone who actually knows what they're doing." Jane's hands clenched into fists at her sides. She wanted to scream, to cry, to walk away and never come back. But she couldn't. She needed this job. She had bills to pay, a younger brother to support, and dreams of going back to school, so she swallowed her pride and nodded. "I'll get my manager," she said quietly, turning away before he could see the tears welling in her eyes. Jane had been working at the diner for 2 years now. It wasn't the kind of job she had dreamed of as a little girl, but it paid the bills, and in her world, that was enough. The diner was a small, family-owned place called Patel's Corner, tucked between a laundromat and a hardware store in a neighborhood that had seen better days. The sign outside flickered at night, and the booths were patched with duct tape, but the food was good, and the people who ran it were even better. For Jane, it wasn't just a job, it was a lifeline. Jane's life had never been easy. She grew up in a rough part of town where the streets were lined with boarded-up windows and the sound of sirens was as common as birdsong. Her mother, a strong-willed woman with a heart full of love but hands worn raw from work, had raised Jane and her younger brother Jamal on her own. She worked 3 jobs cleaning offices, stocking shelves at a grocery store, and doing night shifts at a factory just to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Jane remembered her mother coming home late at night, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion, but always with a smile for her children. "We'll make it," she would say, pulling Jane and Jamal into a tight hug. "We always do." But then, when Jane was 19 and Jamal was just 12, their mother passed away suddenly. It was a heart attack, the doctors said, brought on by years of stress and overwork. Jane's world shattered. Overnight, she became the sole provider for her little brother. She dropped out of college, where she had been studying to become a teacher, and took on whatever odd job she could find. But it wasn't enough. The bills piled up, and the threat of losing their tiny apartment loomed over them like a storm cloud. That's when Mr. Patel entered her life. She had walked into his diner one rainy afternoon, her clothes soaked and her spirit broken, and asked if he was hiring. He took one look at her, a young woman with tired eyes but a determined set to her jaw, and offered her a job on the spot. "You start tomorrow," he said, handing her an apron. "Be here at 6 a.m. From that day on, the diner became Jane's second home. Mr. Patel, a kind man with a thick accent and a laugh that could fill a room, treated her like family. He taught her how to balance trays, take orders, and handle difficult customers. He even let her bring Jamal to the diner after school, where the boy would sit in a corner booth, doing his homework and sneaking fries when he thought no one was looking. The other staff, Maria, the cook with a fiery temper but a heart of gold, and Carlos, the dishwasher who always had a joke, ready became Jane's support system. They were her chosen family, and she loved them for it. But no amount of kindness from Mr. Patel and the others could shield Jane from the racism she faced almost daily. It was the kind of racism that came in small, cutting remarks like when a customer would ask for someone else to serve them or make a snide comment about her hair. It was the kind of racism that made her stomach churn and her hands shake, but she had learned to swallow her anger and keep smiling. She needed this job. She had Jamal to think about and dreams of one day going back to school to finish her degree. So she endured the slights and the insults, telling herself that one day things would be different. Still, there were moments when the weight of it all threatened to crush her. Nights when she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she would ever be more than just a waitress in a run-down diner. Days when she would catch her reflection in the diner's greasy window and see not the strong, capable woman she wanted to be, but a girl who was tired, scared, and unsure of her place in the world. But Jane was a fighter. She had to be. For her mother, who had worked herself to the bone to give her children a chance, for Jamal, who looked up to her with wide, trusting eyes, and for herself, because deep down, she still believed in the dream she had carried since she was a little girl, the dream of standing in front of a classroom, helping kids like her see that they could be more than the world told them they were. The diner was just a stepping stone, she told herself, a place to gather her strength and save her money. One day, she would leave it behind and chase the future she deserved. But for now, it was home. And as long as she had Mr. Patel, Maria, Carlos, and Jamal by her side, she could keep going. She had to. As Jane turned away from Mr. Grayson's table, her legs felt like they were made of lead. Each step toward the kitchen was a struggle, her chest tight and her vision blurred by the tears she refused to let fall. She could still hear his voice echoing in her ears, sharp and cruel, cutting through her like a knife. "You people are always so careless. Why don't you go back to where you came from?" The words stung, not just because they were hateful, but because they were a reminder of how often she had heard them before. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how kind she was, there were always people like Mr. Grayson who saw her as less than human. She was almost at the kitchen door when she felt a hand on her shoulder. Startled, she turned to see Mr. Patel standing there, his dark eyes filled with concern. He had been watching the exchange from behind the counter, his usual cheerful demeanor replaced by a look of quiet anger. "Jane," he said gently, his voice low so only she could hear. "Are you okay?" She opened her mouth to answer, to tell him she was fine, that she could handle it. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she shook her head, her lips trembling as she fought to hold back the tears. Mr. Patel's expression softened, but only for a moment. His gaze flicked toward Mr. Grayson's table, and his jaw tightened. "Stay here," he said firmly, giving her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "I'll handle this." Jane wanted to protest, to tell him it wasn't worth it, that she could deal with it herself. But the look in his eyes stopped her. This wasn't just about Herrit, it was about the diner, about the principles Mr. Patel had always stood for. He had built this place from the ground up, a safe haven for people from all walks of life, and he wasn't about to let someone like Mr. Grayson ruin that. Mr. Patel walked towards the table, with a calm, measured stride, his hands clasped behind his back. To anyone watching, he looked composed, even polite. But Jane could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers clenched and unclenched. She had seen him angry before, but never like this. This was a quiet, simmering anger, the kind that came from years of dealing with people who thought they were better than everyone else. "Is there a problem, sir?" Mr. Patel asked, his voice steady but with an edge that made it clear this wasn't a casual question. Mr. Grayson looked up, his sneer faltering slightly under Mr. Patel's gaze. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he clearly considered beneath him. "Yeah, there's a problem," he snapped, gesturing toward Jane. "Your waitress is incompetent. I want someone else to serve me." Mr. Patel didn't flinch. He crossed his arms over his chest, his expression unreadable. "Jane is one of my best employees," he said, his tone firm but calm. "If there's an issue, I'm sure it can be resolved respectfully." "Respectfully?" Mr. Grayson scoffed, his voice rising. "Why should I respect her? She's just a—" "Enough," Mr. Patel interrupted, his voice sharp and cutting through the diner like a whip. The room seemed to hold its breath. Even the clatter of dishes in the kitchen stopped. "I won't tolerate racism in my establishment. You will apologize to Jane, or you will leave." For a moment, Mr. Grayson looked stunned, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Then his face turned red with rage, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You can't talk to me like that," he shouted, his voice echoing through the diner. "Do you know who I am?" Mr. Patel didn't back down. He took a step closer, his eyes locked on Mr. Grayson's. "I don't care who you are," he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of authority. "No one disrespects my staff. Now apologize or get out." The tension in the room was palpable. Every eye in the diner was fixed on the two men, the air thick with anticipation. Jane stood frozen by the kitchen door, her heart pounding in her chest. She had never seen Mr. Patel like this before, so calm, so controlled, but with a fire in his eyes that made it clear he wasn't going to back down. Mr. Grayson hesitated, his bravado faltering under Mr. Patel's unwavering gaze. For a moment it looked like he might apologize, but then his pride got the better of him. He shoved his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor, and stood up, his face twisted with anger. "You'll regret this," he spat, grabbing his coat and storming toward the door. "I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of place this is." The door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing through the silent diner. For a moment, no one moved. Then, slowly, the noise returned, the clinking of plates, the murmur of voices, the hum of life going on. But something had changed. The air felt lighter, as if a storm had passed. Mr. Patel turned back to Jane, his expression softening. He walked over to her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" he asked again, his voice gentle. This time Jane nodded, a small, grateful smile tugging at her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mr. Patel gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Always," he said. "You are family." And in that moment, Jane knew she wasn't alone. She had people who cared about her, who would stand up for her no matter what, and that made all the difference. Councilman Harris walked over to her, his expression softening as he approached. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. Jane nodded, though she wasn't sure if she meant it. I think so," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for standing up for me." The councilman gave her a kind smile. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "What he did was wrong, and I couldn't just sit by and let it happen. You're a strong young woman, Jane. Don't let people like him define your worth." His words were meant to comfort her, but they also brought a fresh wave of emotion. Jane felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, and she quickly blinked them away. She wasn't used to people standing up for her like this. It was overwhelming, but in the best possible way. Mr. Patel joined them, placing a reassuring hand on Jane's shoulder. "Your family," he said, his voice filled with warmth, "and we take care of our own." Jane looked at the two men standing before her, their faces filled with kindness and determination, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe the world wasn't as cruel as it sometimes seemed. Maybe there were still people who cared, who would stand up for what was right. The diner slowly returned to its usual rhythm, the noise of clinking plates and murmured conversations filling the air once more. But something had changed. The atmosphere felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Jane took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing for the first time all evening. She didn't know what the future held, but for now, she was safe, and that was enough. Mr. Patel gently guided Jane away from the bustling diner, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder as they stepped into the quieter back hallway near the kitchen. The hum of the diner faded into the background, replaced by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the distant clatter of dishes. He turned to face her, his dark eyes filled with a mixture of concern and determination. "Jane," he began, his voice soft but steady, "I'm so sorry you had to go through that. You don't deserve to be treated that way. No one does." Jane nodded, her throat tight with emotion. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, tears spilled down her cheeks, hot and unstoppable. She wiped them away quickly, embarrassed, but Mr. Patel didn't seem to mind. He handed her a clean handkerchief from his pocket, his expression kind and patient. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling, "for standing up for me. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been here." Mr. Patel shook his head, his tone firm but gentle. "You don't have to thank me, Jane. You're family, and family looks out for each other, always." He paused, his gaze steady. "You're one of the strongest people I know. Don't let someone like him make you forget that." Jane nodded again, clutching the handkerchief in her hands. She wanted to believe him, to believe that she was strong, but the weight of the evening still pressed heavily on her chest. It wasn't just Mr. Grayson's words, it was the years of microaggressions, the sideways glances, the whispered comments that had chipped away at her confidence. Tonight had just been the breaking point. As if sensing her thoughts, Mr. Patel placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch grounding her. "You're not alone, Jane, remember that. You've got me, Maria, Carlos, Jamal, all of us. We're in your corner." Before Jane could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Councilman Harris appeared, his tall frame filling the narrow space. He approached them with a calm, measured stride, his expression thoughtful. "Jane," he said, his voice warm but authoritative, "I just wanted to check on you. Are you holding up okay?" Jane nodded, though her eyes were still glistening with tears. I'm okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Councilman, for what you did back there. It meant a lot." The councilman smiled, a kind, reassuring smile that reached his eyes. "You don't have to thank me," he said. "What I did was the bare minimum. No one should have to endure what you went through tonight." He paused, his gaze steady. "You're a strong young woman, Jane. Don't let people like him define your worth. You have so much to offer this world, and I have no doubt you'll go far." Jane felt a lump rise in her throat. His words were kind, but they also stirred something deep inside her, a flicker of hope, a reminder of the dreams she had tucked away. She thought of her mother, of the sacrifices she had made to give Jane and Jamal a better life. She thought of Jamal, who looked up to her with such unwavering faith, and she thought of herself, of the person she wanted to become. "If you ever need anything," the councilman continued, pulling a business card from his pocket and handing it to her, "don't hesitate to reach out. Whether it's advice, resources, or just someone to talk to, I'm here." Jane took the card, her fingers trembling slightly. "Thank you," she said again, her voice stronger this time. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," the councilman replied. "Just keep being you. That's more than enough." Mr. Patel gave Jane's shoulder one last reassuring squeeze before stepping back. "Why don't you take a few minutes to collect yourself?" he suggested. "Maria can cover your tables for a bit. You've been through a lot tonight." Jane nodded, grateful for the offer. She watched as Mr. Patel and the councilman walked back toward the diner, their voices low as they discussed something she couldn't quite hear. For the first time all evening, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. She wasn't alone. She had people who cared about her, who believed in her. And that made all the difference. As she stood there in the quiet hallway, the sounds of the diner muffled in the background, Jane took a deep breath. She wiped away the last of her tears and straightened her apron. The night wasn't over yet, and neither was she. She had a job to do, a brother to take care of, and dreams to chase. And no one, not Mr. Grayson, not any, was going to take that away from her. With a renewed sense of determination, Jane tucked the councilman's business card into her pocket and walked back into the diner, ready to face whatever came next. In the weeks that followed, the incident became a turning point for Jane. The story spread through the community, and people rallied around her, offering support and encouragement. Grayson's business suffered as word of his behavior got out, and he was forced to issue a public apology. Jane, inspired by the kindness she had received, decided to pursue her dream of becoming a teacher. With the help of scholarships and community donations, she enrolled in night classes while continuing to work at the diner. The diner, now a symbol of resilience and unity, thrived. Customers came from far and wide to show their support, and Jane became a local hero. She never forgot the lessons she learned that night, that kindness and courage could overcome even the darkest forms of hatred. And as she stood behind the counter, serving coffee with a smile, she knew that her future was brighter than ever.